Hi, I'm Aidan, and I was lucky enough to talk to Eugene Ughetti, the Artistic Director of Speak Percussion.
I think my first experiences with music as a child were potentially too early to remember, but I was lucky enough to have a father who was a musician, and he owned a music shop. So I dare say that some of my first experiences were just being in the music shop surrounded by instruments. And aside from being able to touch and look at the instruments, it was probably about meeting customers who were coming in and trying them out. And one of my strongest memories as a kid, even both before and after having started learning music, it was the middle of the 80s, which was where heavy metal was really starting to take off. And I remember just being, his shop was the kind of one of the main go-to places for metal in Melbourne. I remember being this kid, hearing these young, kind of long-haired teenagers thrash out on guitars and things, and just being surrounded by this kind of new evolving music culture that was happening in Melbourne. From about the age of 14, I started playing in symphony orchestras, and I think as soon as I did that, I touched a very, very deep musical culture that, say, before that, playing in rock bands or playing alone or even listening to CDs didn't give quite the same experience. I realised that actually this thing that was music that I'd been doing from a young age could in fact be a lifelong journey. And that was the most inspiring thing about being at that age and playing with the orchestra, was that I knew that this tradition was basically an insatiable pursuit. At the end of high school, I was faced with the choice of whether I should move forward as a composer or as a percussionist. And I, in fact, auditioned as both a composer and percussionist at the uni. And then soon after discovered that I couldn't, in fact, do a double major. So I really had to choose between one course or the other. And I was very much tied between the two disciplines. And the only thing that really distinguished one from the other for me was that I thought career-wise it was probably a smarter move to start my career as a performer rather than as a composer, simply because there were more opportunities to play, and probably as a short-term goal was easier to have success early on as a player rather than as a composer. In the early years outside of uni, I had already started Speak Percussion, so a big part of that was pushing the company forwards. And so some of the skills were around career management, and they were about writing grants, the idea of a media release and how that might impact on the success of a performance, programming concerts rather than just playing in them. So really the early years, and even I'd say more than the first 5 years, but the first 10 years outside of uni were about, for me particularly, were about understanding the mechanisms behind arts organisations. So it was kind of less about music and more about the mechanisms around that. University was a fantastic learning experience, not just for what was purely written into the course, but for a whole range of other things. And when I look back at the course, I think probably one of the biggest lessons for me was to manage burnout. And halfway through the course, I was applying for international projects and placements, and I remember just being at a point where I had, a recital to play and then an audition to take with different repertoire, and then other academic subjects coming to a close with essays due, and I found myself at a point where I was not really about to have a breakdown, although probably if I'd pushed myself further I would have. And it was really about managing fatigue, managing stress. And I think that was one of the biggest lessons I could have learned, because aside from managing time better and having a more balanced work schedule, it was much more about taking on a bigger load and not getting as overwhelmed by it. early on in your career, I think it's important to say yes to as many opportunities as possible. You want to be the person who is taking the opportunities and doing the work and being out there and being active. At a certain point, if you have enough success, there's more work and more opportunities available to you than you can possibly respond to. And I think a big lesson for me was learning how to say no at some point as well, to say actually that particular opportunity, even though it's good, maybe isn't quite the right thing now. And that may be for a whole range of reasons. So learning to say no at the right time was an important decision and a difficult one. The personal sacrifices in an artistic career are probably many for most and quite diverse, I think, too, for a whole range of different people. But for me personally, I think I've been lucky enough to have a relatively smooth ride so far. But I think overall, the big challenge has always come down to personal relationships with friends and family. So not that I've had to sacrifice them per se, but I think that certainly I've had to turn most of my energy to my music and to my art. And as a result, I haven't been able to kind of party and socialise in the way that I maybe would have naturally done if I didn't have that passion. So certainly those interpersonal relationships have had less attention. And yeah, I mean, I think that I've had to work extraordinarily hard. So just in terms of free time and in terms of the sort of remuneration that one might claim from their professional work, the balance isn't necessarily the same if you would compare it to a different career. So I wouldn't complain about that, but I would certainly say that it's been a challenge for sure. Thinking about what the hardest decision I've ever had to make is around developing my artistic identity. And part of that is also saying goodbye, bringing closure to things which maybe some years ago were true to you. And so part of that is that I've moved away now from the orchestral tradition. So I don't really actively work with orchestras anymore at all. Even though I still love them, it's something that I've consciously stepped away from. And I've also stepped away from being a freelancing percussionist. So the vast majority of my work happens from within Speak Percussion. So it is very hard to be letting go of things that were once really important to you, but at the same time, that's been it's been difficult, but it's been a really important part of growing as an artist. One of the things that I think was innately present within me from even a young age was this ability to self-evaluate. So this question around constantly trying to evolve my art, but also evolve myself as a human being in general. But this sense of being able to kind of self-evaluate, self-criticize, and find a way forward, so that to not be satisfied that with one good outcome that I would have to necessarily go and repeat that formula. It can go other ways. I've seen artists who are totally crippled by their self-criticizing minds, but the idea of saying, okay, I'm going to keep inquiring into this and what's the kind of the greater essence of who I can possibly be. And as a result, it's been very much a kind of a self-inquiry process. For me, I guess it's a very complex question to answer. I mean, success in terms of making art music has really covers a whole range of things. One of it is commissioning a body of work. So there's been at least a 10-year period now for me, maybe more like 15 years of commissioning new work. So there's a huge body of over 80 works that I've commissioned through both individually, but mainly through Speak Percussion. Another part of it is being close to the current literature, which I guess you could describe as contemporary classical music or new music that's being commissioned by other people. So for me, it's about being at the kind of the bleeding edge of making this new work, interpreting this new work, pushing the art form forward, and doing it in a sustainable way. So for me, that's successful. And probably above all, if you have a refined sense of what you believe is important and what defines quality in the art music world, and if you can uphold your own standards, then I think you've been successful. One of my most important pieces of advice regarding post-tertiary life is to try and find, well, two main things. One is try to find a smooth transition into the profession. So preferably if you can work a bit before you leave university, you'll find that hopefully there are jobs either emerging or already there for you. And another important transition strategy is to look at international education opportunities that might be available. And so that's one of the things I did quite extensively straight after uni. So I auditioned for a range of international summer academies. So some of them were based around orchestras and performance, and probably the most important one that I got involved in was the Lucerne Festival Academy, which is a program set up by Pierre Boulez, and it's has tutors from the ensemble Intercontemporain from Paris, and they have essentially like-minded young musicians, I think the age of 28 and under, from all over the world coming together to make contemporary music. So that course was very much an education experience, but it was run in such a way that it felt and looked like a professional engagement. If I had to give any piece of advice, I would probably advise young artists and young musicians to think, to be aware that your career isn't necessarily going to come from other people wanting to see you succeed, or it isn't necessarily going to come from existing institutions or organisations that just need you to support what they do. So a really important part of having success is making your success. And that in my case meant starting an arts organisation, but it also meant putting on my own concerts and instigating commissions or instigating collaborations and making them happen effectively out of nothing. And there are a number of lucky enough people who get the call and they get the kind of the opportunity that allows their career to kind of snowball. But I think most artists don't get that opportunity. Most artists have to bridge that gap themselves.